Manchester City can spend £500 million a season, every season, under the new profit and sustainability rules that affect the Premier League that have been agreed in principle by a majority of Premier League clubs that will be ratified in the summer. That is the summary takeaway from Kieran Maguire, football finance expert Kieran Maguire. And when he talks, most people pay attention. He's not wrong. He's crunched the numbers, and the new rules that move the focus away from your profit and your loss, the current rules in which all of the current investigatory periods with teams like Nottingham Forest and Everton and Leicester, and obviously Manchester City for the 115 charges, and more recently Chelsea, all will still face investigation and still face the consequences of their actions under current rules. But the new rules that will pivot to reflect a similar approach to what is currently held by UEFA's profit and sustainability rules that doesn't reflect on profit and loss. It focuses more on the percentage of your revenue as a spend on things like your player transfer spend, your player salaries, your staff salaries in general, and agents' fees. And under the new vision, Manchester City can spend £500 million a year. Sounds scary, right? If you're a fan of a different Premier League team, you're probably thinking on paper, how are we going to compete? They're already the best team, the best well-rounded outfit with everything in the right place. We need something that can hold them back, not help them. Well, on paper, it sounds scary, but in reality, nothing really changes, and we're going to explain why. If you're new to the channel, then please hit the subscribe button. It will really help me out. Really appreciate it. Hit the like button if you enjoy the content. Hit the notification bell and drop a comment. Let me know your thoughts on today's video. Let's get the article up just so that we can go through it bit by bit for you. This is from Football 365, but it's been reported everywhere else. Man City can spend $500 million under new UEFA FFP rules if they avoid expulsion after a record-breaking year. Manchester City will be allowed to spend $500 million as it has been voted in by the Premier League clubs if they avoid expulsion from the top flight, of course. City broke the Premier League record for total revenue in 2023, bringing in £713 million across the season. And after the Premier League clubs voted to replace the current profit and sustainability rules to fall in line with UEFA's cost cap model, transfer expert Kieran Maguire explains that the reigning champions will therefore be able to spend around £500 million each season without breaking FFP. City, he said, will be delighted that the Premier League have adopted a squad control cap that is similar to the one that exists within UEFA. We can assume that it's going to be a 70% cap for those clubs that qualify for European competition. That would allow Manchester City to spend around about £500 million a year in respect of wages, agents' fees, and their net transfer costs. Then it comes down to just how much of an investment Abu Dhabi want to make in Manchester City. Do they want to be close to the limit, or do they want to operate well within it and actually become a more profitable organization? That could all be immaterial, though, with the prospect of expulsion from the Premier League as a result of their 115 charges. We've spoken about this. We're not even sure yet when their day in court will come. If and when it happens, we will discuss that at the time. So the article is kind of hyperbolic in as much that Manchester City can spend £500 million without being at threat of breaking profit and sustainability rules. Those current rules prohibit clubs from losing more than £105 million over a 3-year period, £35 million per season. But for what it's worth, Manchester City are not a club that has ever really been at threat of breaking those rules regarding losses in recent history. Last year's accounts, for example, showed a profit for Manchester City of 80.4 million, nearly double that of the previous year's record of 41 million. And because of Manchester City's propensity to identify and nurture some of the top talent around Europe through their academy, through their youth system, when those players are deemed surplus to requirements for Manchester City's needs, often those players are loaned out, and then those players will eventually be moved on into teams around Europe with sell-on fees and buyback clauses. As a Tottenham Hotspur fan, I can sort of talk about Pedro Porro, a player that came to us from Portugal, from Sporting. But in that deal, when we paid Sporting, I think it was £44 million in the end, Manchester City received, I think, about £18 million as a sell-on fee. I could be wrong about the numbers, don't quote me, but you'll take the point. Manchester City have a wonderful track record these days of being sustainable. They have a wonderful thoroughfare of talent, almost a conveyor belt of players that move on, and those players are deemed as pure profit under the current rules. When these rules change and move to something that reflects more along the lines of the UEFA system, then Manchester City will also not really be under threat. And that's the point of the video. It doesn't really affect them like it does other teams. I'll show you why. So Manchester City already have to comply with UEFA's rules. And as I've already mentioned, that is not based on how much money you make as a profit or lose as a loss on your account. That is based on a percentage of the revenue that you bring in as a football club that limits the amount of money you can spend. Now, the Premier League intend to move the rules to about an 85% threshold. So whatever a football club brings in revenue, 85% of that number is the absolute cap that one team can spend every year on the combination, the aggregated, conflated number of your players' wages, the staff wages in the coaching team, your agents' fees, and of course, your net transfer spend. So we no longer have to worry about amortization. We no longer have to worry about homegrown and pure profit. And Manchester City, whilst they were a beneficiary of those rules, are also a beneficiary of the new rules, given that they had over £700 million in profit last year. That's where Kieran Maguire is getting his number from. He's using it as the 70% threshold because UEFA's threshold will eventually, under their vision, drop to a 70% cap in 2 years' time. And Manchester City, if they want to participate in Europe, will have to abide by a stricter set of rules to participate in Europe than you will have to in the Premier League. The fact that Manchester City are already obliging by those revenue spend cap rules in UEFA will basically mean that there is no threat for Manchester City now. There is no threat in the future for the Premier League rules. And so their only concern is about the historical 115 charges. Now, what's important to remember is that whilst the £500 million sounds insane, it sounds like they can spend what they want on who they want every year, and it will be impossible for teams like Tottenham, Manchester United, Arsenal, Liverpool to keep up when Manchester City have such a ridiculous revenue threshold that if they can spend that much money and they don't need to make that many changes to their team, then how does anyone stand a chance? Well, the devil is in the detail. And that is really because, guys, Manchester City already spend a significant proportion of their revenue on these same metrics that are going to be reflected in the new rules. For example, from ESPN here, Manchester City will become the first British club to post £400 million wage bill. This is from November 2023. Manchester City have revealed the price of last season's historic treble after becoming the first club in British football history to spend more than £400 million on annual wages. The reigning Champions League, Premier League, and FA Cup champions have reported record revenues of £712 million, an increase of £99.8 million on the previous year. In the club's annual report for the 22-23 season, City's profits increased to £80 million from £41 million the year prior. City continues to contest the 115 charges. The club's rocketing wage bill saw salary costs, including the annual £45 million salary of striker Erling Haaland, jump £69 million to an overall £422.9 million last season, despite the clubs employing 56 fewer staff than the previous year. City added Haaland, Alvarez, Phillips to their squad in the 22 summer transfer window and offloaded Sterling, Gabriel Jesus, and Zinchenko. In contrast to City's record wage bill, neighbours Manchester United reported an annual wage bill of £331 million last month, £91.8 million lower than the salary costs at the Etihad Stadium. So listen, we are going to take a quick look in a minute at the other comparing football clubs here, because that's the real net. So £400 million of that £500 million budget, if you like, is already being spent on player wages. Now, we haven't baked in people like Erling Haaland's father and his agent's fees because they're one-off. But for argument's sake, if you were interested and if you were thinking that Manchester City may spend that sort of money again, then Manchester City, according to these reports, paid the agent and the father and the family figures around £36 million on top of their wage bill. Now, this number would be included in any potential budgetary constraints or restraints going forward. Looking at one other piece of information here, if you can take a look just quickly at last season's transfer window for Manchester City, they had a net spend of 133 million euros. Let's call that 110 million pound in net spend for all of the outgoing players and the incoming players. So when you add that up, 110 million pound, 30 or 40 million pound for Erling Haaland's agents fees, and the 400 million pound in spend, then you can see that in actual fact, the 500 million pound budget that Kieran Maguire is saying and is taking as, and the media running with it as incredible hyperbole around how lethal Manchester City can be in the transfer market. In reality, it's already being spent. In fact, if you add those numbers up, they're already spending more than 550 million pound on last season. Now, of course, not every season will have Erling Haaland's father and the Raiola agent fees included, but that might happen in the future. Of course, there'll be players that are coming and going, but ultimately nothing really changes. Manchester City will probably find themselves closer to thresholds regarding FFP under this system for the Premier League than they would have done under the old system that is currently still in place around profit and loss, because Manchester City post profits every single year and so face no threat at all from any kind of P&L based issues with regards the current system that is being extricated from the Premier League's profit and sustainability rules. So to me, Manchester City were not a threat in the previous rules. They're not really a threat in the current rules that we'll be moving into next year. Other teams, however, have a lot more concerns with regards the shift. And I want to show you just a couple of areas where that might be true, depending on who you support. You may or may not like to see this, but this is a graph from the most recent data, the 2021-22 season. And you can see at the bottom here, the percentage of wages to revenue based on that particular season. Now, of course, there's another year worth of revenue data that hasn't yet come to light, so we'll have to reflect on this at the time. But you can see the teams here that are struggling under the pivot towards FFP, under a percentage of revenue spend. Newcastle United, a 94% of their annual revenue in this particular season. Now, this season doesn't include their Champions League revenue, but 94% of that particular season's revenue was spent on their wage bill. Everton, 95%. Aston Villa, 81%. Crystal Palace, 77%. Let's look at Chelsea, 71%. Manchester United, 70%. These teams, if they want to participate in the European football in the next year or two, then they will need to be very, very careful of making sure that they do not fall foul of the current PSR rules for the Premier League, the future PSR rules for the Premier League, and of course, the UEFA ones. The one club that I think you can take a look at here and see, or the two clubs potentially that have the best ratios that are worth pointing out. Tottenham Hotspur, this particular year, we were in the Champions League, 47%. And Arsenal, even though they have a very similar wage bill, their revenues look different. But this year, of course, Arsenal will have been in the Champions League, which isn't reflected on this particular set of accounts. So the current system, the future system, if we're moving away from profit and sustainability, where profit and loss are the focus, and where amortization is no longer an issue, where homegrown pure profit trades are no longer a factor, well, then teams like Chelsea, who are gambling and banking on being able to sell Conor Gallagher to get them out of trouble, may find themselves in yet more strife. Let me know your thoughts, guys. Like, subscribe, and comment. And as always, bye-bye.